Okay, so this is based on a co-authored paper just appeared in the latest issue of Social Force, which is a sociology journal, and it touches upon, as I just said, similar questions Maria has raised for the US, and but we're looking at Europe as a whole. So we look at data from 33 countries across the continent, from Finland all the way down to Portugal, from Iceland all the way to Turkey, includes Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe. And so I'm just open the discussion here with a couple of simple facts, mostly from political science research. So you have the rise of nationalist populism, not only in the US, but in many, many countries all over Europe. But one also has to say that some countries have not seen the rise of right-wing populist parties. Portugal, for example, doesn't have a single right-wing populist party. Spain doesn't have one either. A bunch of other countries are spared, if you can use that kind of perspective, of the phenomenon. Then we also know that anti-immigrant rhetoric is crucial for most of these populist right-wing parties. So it's a core element of the message, actually. So it's not a sideshow or something like that. We know that from the UK Independence Party, of course. We know it from the Front National in France. These are just examples that I know that everybody here in the room knows about. That's why I'm putting them up here. Alternative für Deutschland, the same thing. And of course, Trump's version of Republican rhetoric is also deeply anti-immigrant messages a core part of it. We also know from political science research that anti-immigrant attitudes of individuals or voters is the best predictor, actually, of voting for these kind of parties. It's better than education, it's better than age, it's better than being male, it's better than being unemployed, all these kind of things that usually count. They're good predictors of voting for these kind of parties. And yet, anti-immigrant sentiment is not equally prominent in all these different countries. If you look at it from a comparative point of view, it's very low in Sweden, for example. It's very high in Greece, it's very high in Hungary, it's very high in Turkey. And so the question is why? Why are Swedes so much more open to welcome immigrants from faraway places in our Greeks or Hungarians? And we argue, and well, we like to believe that we show in this paper that it's not so much a matter of levels or types of immigration. It's not so much about how many immigrants you have. It's not so much how many immigrants from non-European, meaning non-white origins you have. It's not so much a matter of how many Muslim immigrants you have, as you might be tempted to think in the European context. It's also not about growth. It's not about how have stocks of immigrants increased, not how have stocks of non-white immigrants increased, how much have stocks of non-Muslim immigrants increased. So all of this doesn't really do all that much in explaining different levels of anti-immigrant sentiment across different European countries. Instead, we argued at macro-historical conditions, so we go back into history, that produce different forms of national identities are what matters most, what explains most of the differences in levels of anti-immigrant sentiment between countries. And these different forms of national identification make individuals, citizens, more or less open to include foreigners, immigrants, in the imagined community of the nation, to use the proverbial Benedict Anderson formula. And these macro-historical conditions we show, that's kind of a sideline of our argument that we have some elements of empirical analysis to back it up. They also influence whether populist nationalism is prominent among the parties, the major parties. So these macro-historical conditions that we look at both explain anti-immigrant sentiment and the rise of these kind of parties. And such that populism doesn't, as a lot of political scientists seem to think, generate these anti-immigrant sentiments. There's not a causal relationship. If you have these parties that rise for whatever reason, and people will start to become more anti-immigrant in their future sentiments. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the existing research, and we can go through that very quickly because Maria has really prepared it really well. There's a lot of, it looks like individual kind of tries to explain anti-immigrant sentiment on the basis of individual characteristics. So you have education, makes individuals more tolerant for whatever reason. Competition for jobs with immigrants, some people think, makes people less tolerant towards immigrants. Contact, a lot of social psychologists think that you just have to put people together and then they get, they become really friends with each other. And anti-immigrant sentiment, disappears. And other people, more political psychology researchers, have thought that if you are a right-winger or if you're a nationalist, then you will find foreigners problematic. It's kind of an individual level ideology. And then you have group level mechanisms. That's the kind of argument that Maria has put forward. So the group threat ideas is probably the most prominent of these arguments. Stocks or flows of immigrants, or the immigrants of different origins and so on and so on, are thought of being the most, well, that's the main drivers for anti-immigrant sentiments. If you have more immigrants, you have more anti-immigrant sentiments. If you have more of certain kinds of immigrants, let's say Muslims or Latinos, you have more anti-immigrant sentiments. And then there's people who look at events. There's a paper by Joshka Legevi that shows or tries to show that if you have a terrorist attack, as you had in the Bali bombings a long time ago, then immigrants or anti-immigrant sentiment mushrooms as a result of that. So it's a more kind of eventful, historical view of what drives anti-immigrant sentiments. And then finally, you have kind of country level political variables. That's what political scientists like to do. So the argument that I've already mentioned is if you have right-wing parties, then people will become primed and so on. So they will think of anti-immigrants in more terms. And a lot of people think it has to do with electoral systems. That's the bread and butter of scientists. Proportional systems of election, small parties that become visible, and then the rhetoric's going to spill over into the mainstream. And then you have people who have looked at the media, and they actually blame the media for scandalizing immigrants, having negative stories about immigrants, and then this kind of, again, influences how people think about immigration. And if the media, for whatever reason, turn negative on immigrants, then the population will follow like lemmings and kind of jump over the cliff into the abysm of right-wing politics. Okay, what's missing in this story, according to our view, is that even if you control for all these kinds of things, there's actually a large variation between countries in the average level of anti-immigrant sentiment that is left unexplained. And what we need to do is to bring in a long-term, more historically informed comparative perspective to account for these remaining very large, substantial differences in how open or closed towards immigration citizens of different countries are. And what we do here in this paper is we focus on different trajectories of nation-state formation so that's basically 19th and 20th century, that produces different types and different intensities of national identities. And these then imply these different types and intensities of national identities, different boundary dynamics vis-a-vis immigrant others. It then becomes more or less difficult to perceive immigrants as part of the community of citizens or future citizens, and to see them as part actually of the we rather than endangering and threatening others. Okay, so here's in some detail. So we argue that this process of nation-state formation can be more or less traumatic from the point of view of a nationalist. And traumatic is loss of territory or loss of sovereignty through war or occupation. This doesn't make much sense for the US, although we can talk about the US later on. It does make sense for the US as well, but it's not less intuitive for you guys living here in the US than for most Europeans who have seen war, occupation, countries being divided, reunited, reshaped, and so on over the last 200 years. And example is loss of territory. You know, Hungary lost, what is it, 2/3 or 3/4 of its territory in the Treaty of Trianon in the 1924 or something like that. Loss of sovereignty, of course, you can think of the Baltic states, they were occupied, they were independent very briefly after World War I, and then were reoccupied, reconquered by Russia and dominated by Washington in 1918. And then the other element of this traumatic history is conflicts that threaten territory and or sovereignty, and these can be internal conflicts such as secessionist movements, think of contemporary Spain, think of Turkey, the Kurdish secessionist movement, and so on and so on and so on. Or they can be external through interstate conflict or irredentist, where one state claims the territory of a neighboring state and so on. Think of the Turkey-Greece conflict, which is a very long history. Ukraine and Russia, just recently the Crimea thing and so on. That's of course a more recent example. And traumatic histories of nation-state formation then translate into hostilities towards non-national others. And here in the next slide is the detailed arguments of how that happens. So we have these threat to sovereignty or territory by non-national others, by other countries, by domestic ethnic minorities, and so on. And then, if that happens, then the nation, rather than the state, becomes the focus of identification, because the state absolutely hasn't been able to safeguard the interests of the nation in the view of the citizenry. So the focus of identification shifts towards the people, the nation who has an imagined unity, away from the state. So then you have ethnic rather than civic nationalism, to use a kind of a well-established distinction. And then that makes acceptance or trust in non-national others more difficult, we argue. And then there's two processes here. One is path dependency. So even long after these traumatic histories have passed, these moments have passed, there's a routinization of these understanding of the self as being threatened by non-national others and so on, through history books, through collective memories, through the kind of stories that grandmothers and grandfathers tell their children, and these kinds of things. And then there's a process of generalization. These negative attitudes are to become kind of detached towards the ethnic or national or country that proved to be or was perceived as being traumatic, and becomes generalized to all to all non-members of the nation. Okay, and then you end up with contemporary anti-immigrant sentiment. So that's the detailed mechanism, how it actually works, and what I'm going to show you is two steps of the analysis. First, I'm just connecting the blue stuff here. So I'm going to show you that if you had these threats to national sovereignty and or territory in the past, you have more anti-immigrant sentiment today. And then in the second step, I'm going to do the red stuff here. I'm going to show you how this works through intermediary steps. Okay. I don't know how much time do I actually have. I think I'm 20.
Go on.
Go on. Go on.
Well, you've spoken for 15 minutes, so...
I spoke for 15
minutes. Yeah, but you have...
Okay, so let me do...
Go on. No, it's very interesting, and
you
have another 10 minutes.
Bruce will be more interesting, I promise.
No,
you guys have to say...
You have another 10 minutes, Andreas.
Okay, let me speed up the whole thing a little bit. So this is how we did it in terms of data. So we coded for each country whether there has been a loss of territory and independence, or none of that. And then there's, on the other dimension, there's loss of conflict as a pretty simple coding scheme, as you can imagine. And the darker shaded these fields, the more you have experienced these traumatic kind of things. In the upper left corner, you have loss of territory and of independence since in the 19th, 20th century, and you had external and internal conflict. These should be countries whose populations today are obviously the most xenophobic, the most anti-immigrant. And then we did this for 33 countries that have completed the European Social Survey. That's a kind of a standard survey that a lot of social scientists use. It's a high quality survey, so it's not like the world value surveys kind of thing. So it's it's done by, it's supervised by Norwegian statisticians, so it's actually pretty rigorous and sample frames and the whole thing. And then we integrated these country-level variables into a multi-level model that controls for a lot of other things. Basically, for everything that the quantitative research thinks or has shown is relevant for explaining how anti or pro-immigrant individuals actually feel. And this is the results here. The dependent variable here is response to the question: how many immigrants of different ethnicity/race should be admitted to the country? And these are countries that you can see here. So these are the 33 countries. And you can see a relatively straightforward association, which is a line between these geopolitical threat, levels of geopolitical threat at the bottom. The more threat, the more you have these traumatic events in the past history, and anti-immigrant attitudes on the y-axis. The higher up you are, the more you think no immigrants of different race and ethnicity than us should be admitted. And the results are actually similar if you look at another question. If you are more specifically asking about immigration of poor people from outside the European Union, so it's actually the same general pattern that you see here. And this, I showed you descriptive results, but you do it on the real statistical analysis, controlling for all kinds of other things. Controlling means taking into account other kind of factors that influence reality, and here is what we did: take into account gender, age, education, marriage, rural, urban residents, education of fathers, too much missing data for mothers, political attitudes, whether you're a right-winger or a liberal or a left-winger, religious attendance, how much you go to church or to a mosque in Turkey, occupational status, economic difficulties, how much you do, and so on and so on. A whole bunch of things. At the country level, you look at GDP growth, look at immigration levels, we look at levels of specific groups of immigrants, as I mentioned before, so non-whites, people from Muslim countries. We look at change in these levels, so there's the threat argument actually is more appropriately measured with this change. We look at income inequality within these countries, we look at levels of globalization. These are all kinds of things that people have thought are important. This geopolitical threat variable that we focused on in this article explains more than all the other country level variables together. So it's something that is actually substantially powerful. It's not just that it's significant. So stars show up in your table or at the right place and that you're happy about it and so on. So it's actually really doing something. Okay, so let me talk about a little bit about robustness stuff. Maybe I don't do that. Maybe it's all, you can do all kinds of things. Well, maybe this is a nice graph because the results that I showed you before are just for 1 year, the last year of the European Social Survey. The European Social Survey has been done every 2 years since 2012. And you can see here, and one could argue that a constant, like this geopolitical threat in the past, cannot explain ups and downs in anti-immigrant sentiment. All of a sudden, Swedes are no longer that pro-immigrant. They have elected the Swedish Democrat Party with 20%, which is an anti-immigrant, hardcore, right-wing nationalist party. But if you look at this data, at least, then there's not that much variation, actually, over time. Look at this. This is Hungary. It's one of the most consistently xenophobe countries in Europe. And look at it, basically stays the same. And its relative position, relative to other countries, always stays the same. This is Sweden. They're always the nicest people. They always get on your nerves, the Swedes. They're always nice. and the relative position to other countries remains the same. So very few countries actually change their relative position in this overall grid of causal factors. Okay, and more robustness checks. Let's just forget about that. Yeah. Oh, maybe I should mention the last one. So we don't think that it's actually driven by racist sentiment against non-white immigrants. That this is actually what we are picking up somehow. There's almost zero correlation. Oh, it's not true. It's 0.09 between two questions. The one that we are asking: how many immigrants from different race ethnicity should be admitted to your country? And the question of how important is it that these immigrants are white? And so the two things seem to be quite unrelated from each other, which means that our respondents don't understand the different race ethnicity question mainly as a race question. That's what this is. Okay, now the red stuff, these mediating mechanisms that I talked about. Very quickly, so here is the geopolitical threat, that's the variable that is a historical variable, and we use another data set here. Unfortunately, that's only for 18 countries to show that it's highly correlated with, that's a result of a multivariate regression. I'm only showing these kind of results with ethnic nationalism, with emphasis on ancestry, on language competence, and so on, in defining the boundaries belonging to the nation. So you have, consistent with the argument, if you have these geopolitical threats in the past, then citizens of a country identify more with the nation defining these ethnic and ancestry terms than with the state, which would be civic nationalism. And this, in turn, is ethnic nationalism is highly associated with anti-immigrant attitudes. We also show then, now going back to the full set of 33 countries, that geopolitical threat also explains the salience of nationalism in party platforms. In other words, how prevalent nationalist, populist appeals are in party platforms. That's a data set that political scientists have used. But that the salience of this party, of nationalism in party platforms, is actually not associated significantly with anti-immigrant attitudes. In other words, it's not like some political scientists think that the rise of these parties is then generating anti-immigrant sentiment as a consequence of a shift in public discourse. But it is that both the rise of these nationalism in party politics, the rhetorics of parties, and anti-immigrant sentiment are the legacy of these of events in the past that have, that from a nationalist point of view, are traumatic. I think that's it. There's more. The generalization mechanism.
You need to come to a close.
Yeah. Okay. Conclusion. Conclusions are always boring because you just kind of repeat what you've already said. But okay. So it's worth to explore, we think, the historical roots of anti-immigrant sentiment from a comparative point of view. So to go deeper into history to explain the very sizable and consistent variation that we find between countries. Obviously, this kind of approach cannot explain the short-term fluctuations that you have in such sentiments. Some of it might be the result of the rise and fall of populist parties. Some of it might be the events, like the Paris terrorist attacks and so on. And immediately survey people after that. They will indeed say, yeah, immigrants are terrible and so on. We should have much fewer of them. But then 2-3 months later, they might be back to the baseline of having anti-immigrant sentiment. So we cannot explain, these ups and downs here, but what we can explain is the bandwidth within which these ups and downs in different countries are moving. So we can explain the difference between the red and the blue country here, and not the ups and downs within these. And I was trying to have some political implications because you have this in your title, I have to do something like that too. But unfortunately, history cannot be engineered backwards. So you cannot have Hungary have a less traumatic history than the state. You cannot make Hungary keep all these Eastern European domains. And most of the people who actually currently live in these domains do not want to be ruled by Hungarians again. So not that much can actually be done. If you look at this from the country level, contact, having people have contact with each other, won't undo what history has inscribed in people's consciousness, and has made them more or less receptive to the idea that other kinds of people could be part of the us, could become part of the community of citizens. Hostile media coverage, according to our analysis, might just be reflecting anti-immigrant sentiment that is widespread rather than actually generating it. Enlightened intellectuals like us going out to the middle of the country and telling people that they should use other kind of categories, that they should think differently about the world, like some people at ASA seem to think, the American Sociological Association, like kind of things that we should get out there to the middle of the country and teach Trump supporters what they're wrong about and how they see the world. I don't think that this would work, and I think it's done.
Thank you very much.